Imagine living in a time without human rights. No lawyers, no appeals, just pain. A world where justice was not measured by truth, but by screams. Tonight, we open the gate to a forgotten age where sin was burned from the flesh and fear ruled the land. This isn't myth, it's history. Welcome to the forgotten horrors of medieval punishments, a journey into the darkest corners of human cruelty, where punishment didn't just end life, it shattered the soul. The tongue cutter, when truth became a crime. Imagine a world where silence is survival, where a single word, spoken at the wrong time to the wrong ears, could cost you not just your freedom, but your voice forever. In the Middle Ages, truth was not sacred. It was dangerous. To speak against power was to challenge God himself. And those who dared to speak, those who whispered rebellion or proclaimed inconvenient truths, were met with a punishment both brutal and symbolic, the severing of the tongue. This was no rare execution reserved for high traitors. This was public justice, a lesson burned into the flesh and carved into memory. Depending on region and ruler, the sentence was carried out in a variety of ways, all equally grotesque. Sometimes a red-hot iron clamp was used to grasp the tongue and pull it out, stretching it until the executioner's knife hacked through the muscle. Other times a dull blade was chosen, not to kill, but to maximize suffering, tearing instead of slicing. And in the most horrific instances, a long metal pin was driven through the tongue and nailed to the jaw, silencing the mouth with rust and rot until infection consumed the condemned. There was no dignity, no hope, no voice, just blood, screams, silence. 33. In southern France, a woman named Eloise de Narvaez of a blacksmith stood at the town market and made a fatal mistake. She said, "The Crusades are not holy. They are the greed of old men sent to die by young fools." Gasps. Silence, and then iron footsteps. She was arrested that evening. The next morning, she was dragged to the center square. The crowd gathered, trembling not out of pity but fear. She was bound to the public scaffold, her mouth forced open with iron tongues. The bishop's guard announced her sentence. For heresy spoken aloud, let her voice be taken. A red-hot clamp gripped her tongue, and the blade fell. The scream that followed was not hers alone. It echoed from the hearts of every soul watching, knowing one day it could be their own. To cut a tongue was not simply punishment. It was a declaration. Your truth means nothing here. Only silence is safe, and even silence is watched. So in this era of faith and fire, the act of speech was not just brave, it was suicidal. And those who paid the price became martyrs to a cause that would not rise for centuries. Their stories, buried in whispers, their screams lost to time. But tonight we remember them, not with words, with silence. The iron chair, where the guilty burned from within. The sun was still rising, but the square was already full. Men stood with folded arms. Women held their children close, shielding their eyes but not their ears. The air hung heavy with anticipation, not of justice, but of vengeance, because today the iron chair would drink fire once more, and someone would burn from the inside. It sat at the center of the plaza like a throne forged in hell. The iron chair, cast entirely from blackened metal, lined with hundreds of small pointed spikes, the chair was a masterpiece of medieval cruelty. There were no cushions, only pain. The armrests pierced the flesh, the back dug into spines, and when the victim sat, the skin tore before the fire even came. But that wasn't the end, because beneath the seat, there were iron trays for burning coals. Once the victim was tied and screaming, fire was lit underneath, slowly roasting their body from below. Their screams became music, their blood, incense, their death, a warning carved into steel and soul. In 1388, in the Kingdom of Bohemia, a man named Johann Krall, a former royal clerk, was accused of treason. The records say he leaked secrets of the crown to rival lords. Some say he was framed. Others say he confessed. But one truth remains. He was sentenced to die, not by sword, not by rope, but by the iron chair. Witnesses wrote of that day. They say he was stripped naked in the frost-bitten dawn, dragged to the square, forced to sit on the chair as the crowd watched with held breath. The guards strapped his arms, his chest, his legs, his neck. He struggled, drawing blood from his own body against the spikes. Then the coals were lit, and slowly, methodically, the chair did its work. It didn't kill quickly. It wasn't meant to. It roasted him inch by inch. They say it took hours. When it was over, there was no triumph, only silence and smoke. The iron chair was not built to kill. It was built to terrify, to show the price of betrayal, to paint the square in horror, to remind every citizen that loyalty is not a virtue, it is survival. In some towns, the chair was left out for days after the execution, still dripping, still hot as a message. We do not forget, we do not forgive, and mercy is not for traitors. So they feared, and they obeyed, not from faith, but from fire. The breaking wheel. When bones became dust, they called it the wheel of death, and for good reason. It didn't whisper, it didn't cut, it shattered, loudly, brutally, slowly. No execution tool inspired more dread across medieval Europe than the breaking wheel, a symbol of divine punishment and public horror. And when it arrived in the town square, rolling over the cobblestones like some cruel omen, everyone knew someone's body would be broken, limb by limb, joint by joint, until mercy meant silence. The condemned was tied to a wooden cart wheel, limbs stretched unnaturally along its radius, each arm, each leg, exposed, vulnerable, waiting. Then came the executioner, not with a sword, not with a dagger, but with an iron rod, thick, cold, and hungry for bone. He didn't strike randomly. He struck with intent, first the shin, then the thigh, then the forearm, then the elbow. The bones cracked like dry branches. The crowd flinched, but no one looked away. The victim screamed, but screaming was part of the ritual. It was music to their gods, proof of guilt, proof of justice, proof of pain. Sometimes the executioner had mercy. He delivered a final blow to the chest, le coup de grace, they called it. Other times, he didn't. The broken man was hoisted high, wheel and all, and left to hang in the wind, his body twisted like a sculpture made of agony. Crows came first, then rot, then memory. But some people didn't die right away. They hung there for hours, some for days, and the town watched. Children were warned. Priests gave sermons in its shadow, and the wheel turned, not with motion, but with fear. This wasn't execution. It was a spectacle, a message from the king, from the church, from heaven. You may break our laws, but we will break your body. In 1581, a German bandit named Peter Neers, believed to have committed over 500 murders, was captured and sentenced to death by wheel. But his execution wasn't swift. He was tortured for days, first with red-hot pincers, then flayed, then broken on the wheel. 42 blows. That's what it took to silence him. And yet, some claim they still heard his screams for nights afterward, echoing through the valley like a curse that refused to die. Because the wheel wasn't just about death. It was about making death unforgettable. So when you hear the creak of old wood, when the wind whistles through the trees, when bones ache for no reason, remember, some wheels turn not to carry us forward, but to remind us how easily we break. The breaking wheel when bones became dust. They called it the wheel of death, and for good reason. It didn't whisper. It didn't cut. It shattered, loudly, brutally, slowly. No execution tool inspired more dread across medieval Europe than the breaking wheel, a symbol of divine punishment and public horror. And when it arrived in the town square, rolling over the cobblestones like some cruel omen, everyone knew someone's body would be broken, limb by limb, joint by joint, until mercy meant silence. The condemned was tied to a wooden cart wheel, limbs stretched unnaturally along its radius, Each arm, each leg exposed, vulnerable, waiting. Then came the executioner, not with a sword, not with a dagger, but with an iron rod, thick, cold, and hungry for bone. He didn't strike randomly. He struck with intent. First the shin, then the thigh, then the forearm, then the elbow. The bones cracked like dry branches. The crowd flinched, but no one looked away. The victim screamed, but screaming was part of the ritual. It was music to their gods, proof of guilt, proof of justice, proof of pain. Sometimes the executioner had mercy. He delivered a final blow to the chest, they called it. Other times, he didn't. The broken man was hoisted high, wheel and all, and left to hang in the wind, his body twisted like a sculpture made of agony. Crows came first, then rot, then memory. But some people didn't die right away. They hung there for hours, some for days, and the town watched. Children were warned. Priests gave sermons in its shadow. And the wheel turned, not with motion, but with fear. This wasn't execution. It was a spectacle, a message from the king, from the church, from heaven. You may break our laws, but we will break your body. In 1581, a German bandit named Peter Neers, believed to have committed over 500 murders, was captured and sentenced to death by wheel. But his execution wasn't swift. He was tortured for days, first with red-hot pincers, then flayed, then broken on the wheel. 42 blows. That's what it took to silence him. And yet, some claim they still heard his screams for nights afterward, echoing through the valley like a curse that refused to die. Because the wheel wasn't just about death. It was about making death unforgettable. So when you hear the creak of old wood, when the wind whistles through the trees, when bones ache for no reason, remember, some wheels turn not to carry us forward, but to remind us how easily we break. The rat phage when hunger became a weapon. There are punishments that slice, there are tortures that burn, and then there are those that wait, quiet, patient, teeth gnashing in the dark. This is the story of the rat cage, a punishment not forged for swift justice, but for the slow unraveling of the human soul. It began not with a sword, not with fire, but with a cage. A simple iron box, open at one end and filled with rats, starving, clawing, panicked. The condemned was bound, sometimes seated, sometimes laid flat. The cage was fastened to their bare stomach or chest. The open end pressed tightly against the flesh, no escape. And then the heat, coals, flames, boiling water poured over the cage, anything to raise the temperature. The rats panicked. They scratched, they screamed. And then they did what desperate creatures do. They dug, through skin, through muscle, through viscera, looking for escape, finding only warm, quivering tunnels of blood. The screams of the victim blended with the shrieks of the rats, a duet of horror, a chorus that echoed through prisons and castles alike. Because this wasn't just torture. It was a statement. We don't need blades to break you. Nature itself will turn against you. In the dungeons of 17th century South America, rebel leaders were said to be broken this way by inquisitors. Rat cages strapped to their genitals, their faces, even their backs. Few survived. None remained sane. But perhaps the most infamous use came from the dark corridors of Europe's worst regimes. Whispers speak of tyrants, spies, and silent chambers where screams were buried beneath stone and straw, and the rats did the rest. It's not the iron that scars, not the fire, not even the teeth. It's the knowing. Knowing that beneath your ribs, beneath your skin, life is devouring you from the inside out, and when they pulled the cage away, if they ever did, there was silence, always silence. No justice, no answers, just a hole where something used to be. So remember, the worst punishments don't end with death. They end with emptiness. It's the pear of anguish, the device that bloomed in suffering. It looks harmless, almost delicate. A small metal object shaped like a flower bud with petals that bloom not under sunlight but under screams. This is the pear of anguish, a device of elegant evil invented not to kill but to shatter what it means to be human. It begins with silence. A prisoner brought into a dim chamber, chained, gagged, trembling. Then comes the pear, cold, mechanical, gleaming, its purpose to be inserted into the mouth, into the rectum, or for women accused of witchcraft or adultery, into the vagina. There the true torment begins. A screw at the end of the device turns slowly, twisting, twisting, as the metal petals inside begin to bloom, forcing the body open from within. Tissues tear, bones crack, organs rupture. There is no blood spray, no dramatic visuals, just the slow blooming of pain, petal by petal, turn by turn. And for what? Confession? Punishment? Or simply the pleasure of cruelty disguised as justice? They say in France it was used on liars, in Spain on heretics, in Italy on women who dared defy their husbands. Each culture had its version, each society had its excuse, but the result was always the same: destruction masked as morality. Survivors, if there were any, were left broken in body and soul. Many were left mute for life if the pear had been used in the mouth. Others bled out days later, infection seeping into wounds never meant to exist. No record tells us how many were silenced by its bloom, because the pear of anguish leaves behind very little, not even a scream if the jaw was crushed, only a quiet ending, and the echo of twisted metal closing shut once more, waiting for its next victim. So if you think cruelty needs fire and chains, remember, sometimes it only takes a flower, the brazen bull screaming in bronze. Imagine a statue, a majestic bull, forged entirely from bronze, life-sized, beautiful, hollow. But this is not art. This is instrumental horror, a masterpiece of cruelty, crafted in ancient Greece, designed not to inspire awe but agony. They called it the brazen bull. At first glance, it resembles a tribute to strength and fertility. But look closer. There's a door on its side, and inside, just enough room for a person, or rather a victim. The condemned is forced inside, naked, shackled, terrified. Then the door is sealed shut. A fire is lit beneath the bull's belly. Slowly, the metal heats, and the human inside begins to cook alive. Their screams, raw, primal, should echo with horror. But here's the twist. The bull is rigged with a system of tubes and valves, an ancient sound design. As the victim howls in agony, their cries are transformed, warped through the mechanics to resemble the bellowing of a bull. Outside, the crowd hears the roar of a beast, not realizing it's a person being roasted from the inside out. The creator of this atrocity, a man named Perillus of Athens, who presented it to the tyrant Phalaris of Agrigentum. Legend says Phalaris asked for a demonstration, so Perillus was locked inside his own invention and burned. He survived the initial torture, only to be thrown off a cliff soon after. Justice, irony, or simply the beginning of the bull's legacy? The brazen bull spread. Rome, Carthage, and other empires adopted it. It became a symbol of state terror, punishment not just for crimes, but for ideas. Christian martyrs, philosophers, rebels, all fed to the beast of bronze. Death inside the brazen bull was not quick. The body would seize, skin would blister, organs would boil, and the skull would eventually crack, releasing steam through the bull's nostrils like a grotesque sigh. When it was finally opened, all that remained was charred flesh fused to bronze. The bull was cleaned, polished, made ready for the next performance. Because to tyrants, this wasn't just execution, it was entertainment. And to this day, the brazen bull reminds us that even beauty can be a disguise, that beneath shining surfaces, true horror may be waiting to roar. The Iron Maiden, beauty laced with spikes, a coffin, tall, elegant, almost regal, crafted of iron, shaped like a woman, with a serene face and flowing robes, as if death itself had been given a mother's embrace. But don't be fooled. This is no sanctuary. It is a trap cloaked in tenderness. They call it the Iron Maiden. Its doors open wide as if to welcome you in, but lining the interior are rows of metal spikes, not long enough to kill instantly, only enough to pierce your shoulders, your sides, your eyes, your limbs. just enough to make you bleed, to make you suffer. Once shut inside, there's no room to move. Every breath, every twitch drives steel deeper into flesh. You are impaled not in one blow, but by 1,000 tiny betrayals of your own body. And the worst part? You don't die immediately. The spikes are strategically placed, designed to avoid vital organs, so you stay conscious, trapped between agony and despair, sometimes for hours, even days. Some Iron Maidens had drainage holes at the bottom to let the blood flow out neatly, a twisted form of cleanliness, a grotesque echo of civilization. And who faced the maiden? Heretics, traitors, witches, sometimes merely those who spoke out of turn. Torture wasn't just punishment, it was a spectacle, a warning, a ritual of fear meant to etch obedience into the bones of anyone watching. But here's the question history still wrestles with. Did the Iron Maiden ever truly exist? Some believe it was a myth, a fabrication of later centuries to paint the Middle Ages darker than they were. Others argue examples were found, reconstructions perhaps, or the real deal buried in dungeons and secrecy. Yet whether real or imagined, the Iron Maiden became legend, a symbol of humanity's capacity to turn metal into cruelty, to give torment a beautiful mask, a false face of mercy, wrapped in iron, soaked in silence, and lined with pain. And if the Iron Maiden never existed, then what does it say that we were capable of dreaming her into being? Because sometimes the most terrifying torture device isn't one we found, but one we invented in the dark corners of our mind. Rat torture, when hunger becomes a weapon. It begins in a cold stone chamber. The air is damp, still, and yet something scurries. The prisoner is stripped, bound, trembling, not from the cold, but from the knowledge of what comes next. There is no axe, no whip, no blade, only a rat, a small, innocent creature, or so it seems. But when hunger takes hold, even innocence can become a tool of unimaginable cruelty. The torturer brings a metal bucket, open at one end. He places it over the victim's bare stomach or chest. Then he traps the rat inside. The prisoner's breathing quickens. They've heard the rumors, the whispers, but now it's real. The torturer heats the top of the bucket slowly, carefully. The rat inside begins to panic. It claws, it writhes, it searches for escape, and there's only one direction to go, down into flesh. The rat begins to burrow. Its claws dig into skin. Its teeth gnash through muscle, driven not by malice but by a primal, desperate hunger to survive. The pain is beyond screaming. It is white hot, alive, like being devoured from the inside out. And it doesn't stop, because as long as the heat continues, the rat keeps digging, through organs, through bone, until the victim is no longer a person, but a hollow vessel of agony. This wasn't a punishment, it was a message, used in ancient Persia, feared in medieval Europe, revived even in modern dictatorships. Why? Because it worked. It broke the spirit. It turned fear into obedience and cruelty into control. And the worst part, it didn't require sophisticated tools, no gallows, no machinery, just a cage, fire, and a creature that simply didn't want to die. A rat, a flame, and the darkness of man's imagination. That's all it took to turn hunger into a weapon. The saw when death was delivered upside down. They say death is supposed to come swiftly, a final breath, a sharp blade, a clean release. But in the shadowed corners of medieval justice, death came differently. It came slowly, and it came upside down. The victim is stripped naked, hung by the ankles. Their head dangles inches above the blood-soaked earth. This position isn't random. It's calculated, brilliantly cruel. You see, when a person is suspended upside down, the blood rushes to the brain. The body stays alert, conscious, alive. The executioners stand nearby, not with swords or axes, but with a long, jagged saw, not one designed for precision, but for tearing. They begin at the groin. The blade bites, rips, grinds through flesh, sinew, and bone, not fast, not efficient, intentionally slow. The pain is unspeakable. The victim screams, until even the voice begins to fracture. But they do not lose consciousness. No, that's the true horror. Because of the position, the brain remains flooded with blood, alert, aware for every inch of agony as the saw makes its way downward through the pelvis, the spine, the ribs. Death only comes when the blade reaches the chest. By then, the soul has long since surrendered. This method wasn't hidden in dungeons, it was performed in public, in markets, in town squares. Why? Because it was a lesson, a message carved not just into flesh, but into memory. Disobey, betray, rebel, and this is what awaits you. Used across Europe and parts of Asia, the saw was favored for its simplicity. No expensive equipment, just wood, iron, and time. And in the end, that's what made it so terrifying. It didn't rely on sophistication, just the patient, rhythmic sawing of human life into silent surrender. A body hung upside down, a blade pushed through bone, and a crowd that didn't look away. The Judas Cradle, purity through pain. Imagine a punishment so personal, so invasive, that it turns the very act of sitting into a dance with death. Welcome to the Judas Cradle, a device born from the blackened heart of medieval Europe, designed not to kill swiftly, but to break you from the inside out. The setup is deceptively simple. A wooden pyramid, its tip razor sharp, its purpose utterly cruel. The victim is stripped, bound, hoisted above the spike, then slowly, agonizingly lowered. The point is not aimed at the chest nor the heart, but at something far more vulnerable, the anus, or for women, often the vagina. There's no cutting edge, no slicing, only pressure, pure, merciless pressure. The weight of the victim's own body becomes the weapon. Pulled down by gravity, flesh tears slowly, muscle rips, organs shift and scream in silence. They are not dropped. That would be too kind. They are lowered inch by inch, a descent into madness. Sometimes the torturer would add weights to the ankles, just a few pounds to hasten the process, to deepen the pain. But death? Death didn't come quickly. That wasn't the point. The Judas Cradle was a punishment of purification. Used by the Inquisition, its victims were accused of blasphemy, witchcraft, sodomy, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They believed pain cleansed the soul, that if your body suffered enough, your spirit might be saved. But what they really ensured was that the body broke before the soul ever had a chance to escape. Infections were common. The spike was rarely cleaned. Blood, excrement, and disease clung to it like memories that refused to fade. Many victims didn't die immediately. They were pulled off the cradle, left to rot in cells, writhing in wounds that refused to close. Some never walked again. Others begged for the release of death and found it only days later. There are no triumphant tales of survival here, only whispers, records scratched into the margins of forgotten ledgers. But the cradle endured, passed from hand to hand, used by those who thought righteousness could be sharpened into a point. So next time you sit comfortably in your chair, spare a thought for the Judas Cradle and those who sat in silence because they had no other choice. As the final scream fades into the stone and the last drop of blood sinks into the soil, we are left with silence. Not peace, but silence. The kind that follows horror too old to forget, too raw to name. The devices we've uncovered, the Iron Maiden, the rack, the saw, the Judas Cradle, were not just metal and wood. They were beliefs made tangible, justice twisted by fear, faith contorted into cruelty. These were not the tools of monsters. They were crafted by men, used by courts, by priests, by kings, by those who claimed righteousness but found satisfaction in the scream. And yet the world did not end in fire. We survived. Scarred, yes. Shamed, perhaps, but wiser. Today we look back not to glorify, not to thrill, but to remember. Because when we forget the darkness, we risk walking into it again. The chains may be gone, but cruelty wears many masks. And history has a habit of repeating, disguised in law, in war, in silence. So let these tales linger. Let them echo in every courtroom, every prison, every place where power meets the powerless. Let them remind us that mercy is not weakness, that justice without compassion becomes a machine far colder than steel. This is where our journey ends, but the story, the warning, lives on. Because the darkest parts of history were forged not in shadow, but in the belief that pain could purify. And in that belief, we became the very thing we feared most.